On today's show, we will be taking a look at the post-draft and free agency Central Division power rankings according to myself and other Locked On NHL hosts. We'll talk about which teams deserve to be at which spots and why the Dallas Stars should be considered a legit threat for a top 3 spot on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
You're Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily in-season podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars media, coming to you on this Friday, August 26th, and today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline.net is where the game starts. Whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring Locked On Stars listener, thank you for tuning in today and for making our show your first listen of the day. If you're new here, please do consider hitting that subscribe button on YouTube. We are on a journey to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of 2022. You can also find and follow us on your favorite podcasting platform, whether that be Spotify or Apple. We are free and available no matter where or how you choose to listen. But without any more hesitation, let's jump right into the meat of today's episode, which is discussing the most recent power rankings that have come out for the Central Division. The Locked On Podcast Network has been going division by division, power ranking each team based on the moves that they made in the offseason, whether that be post-draft or free agency trades, what have you. Just a few handful of days ago, the Locked On Podcast Network tweeted out the power rankings for the Central Division, the last team to do so. And if you're watching on YouTube, you see it on the screen right now, and it looks about how you would expect it to look. You got the Colorado Avalanche coming in at number 1, Minnesota Wild and the St. Louis Blues at the 2 and 3, the Nashville Predators at 4, Stars at 5, Jets, Blackhawks, and Coyotes rounding out the bottom 3. And really, I say it looks exactly like you would expect, and there are some points of contingency or some points of issue, of conflict that I have with this list. And of course, this is a poll from multiple different people, not just one person, not just one duo of people. This is probably roughly maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 people that voted on this poll. And of course, the only one of them, me, being a Dallas Stars fan, supporter, and podcaster. But even just outside of the Dallas Stars, there are still a few positions that I disagree with preseason. And I don't think that these standings will look the exact same now as they do near the middle point or even the end of the season. And really, the biggest point of tension, not just for myself, but many other people as well that responded to this on Twitter, came from both the Dallas Stars and Nashville Predators placement on the list. A lot of people saying that, Nashville was in the right spot and that Dallas should be the 5, but then a lot of arguments for the other way as well, that Dallas should be in the 4th spot and Nashville should be in the 5th. And you can really argue it both ways. I think that there certainly is an argument to be made for the Nashville Predators to be a top 4 team in this division. But I think that there's also one for the Stars. And of course, I'm going to sound biased because I do cover this team. But I really do think that Dallas is, at least as of right now, at preseason, the better team and a team that is set up for more success for this season. And there's a lot that goes into that. And I think, one, we saw just how reliant this Nashville Predators team is on goaltending whenever they played Colorado in the playoffs. And I say that knowing that Colorado was an absolute juggernaut of a team, and the Nashville Predators were down UC Saros, who was one of the better goalies in the NHL when he was healthy and when he was playing. However, he was not able to play against the Colorado Avalanche in round 1, which was unfortunate for them, and maybe with Saros, they maybe get one win out of that series. But it's just really shocking to me that they, for the most part, just got absolutely manhandled in that series. Some of those games were closer than others, but I still feel like even without Saros, you would think that maybe that Predators team, especially in round 1, could potentially get a win or at least pull some sort of win out of that series. But they just looked outmatched pretty much from the start of Game 1 until the conclusion of Game 4. And it's just maybe alarming if you're a Nashville Predators fan, just with the amount of talent on that team outside of Saros, whether it's Yossi, Duchesne, Forsberg. This is, and I'm admitting it even as a Star supporter and podcaster, that Nashville did have an extremely good team. I think they were top 3 in the division for the majority of the season until, things eventually started to maybe fall apart a little bit at the end of last season. And I think that's another reason why Dallas is more set up for success. I think that the Dallas Stars are built for, the grit and grind of the season a little bit better, and I think we saw that play out. Nashville had a fantastic start to the season, maybe an even better middle part of the season than Dallas. Dallas off to a rough start, obviously, and then got a little bit better later on, but then just kind of, stuck with it. They obviously had some rough stretches and lost some games they shouldn't have, but they ultimately were not only able to make the playoffs, but were able to surge past the Nashville Predators at the very end for that top wildcard spot, which, worked out for them in the end, even though both teams were eliminated in round 1. I think Dallas probably would have only won 1 game against the Avs in that first round series, and I think Nashville maybe could have hung a little bit closer with Calgary. I think it was, for either of those teams, the desire was to play the Calgary Flames rather than the Colorado Avalanche, but the Predators, had the first wildcard spot locked up. They had a 4-0 lead against the Arizona Coyotes in the final game of the season, and they blew the lead and lost. Not just a overtime loss, they gave up 5 unanswered goals to the Arizona Coyotes in a game that mattered so much for playoff positioning. And I know the Stars also lost a key game to the Coyotes down the stretch, but they still got a point out of that game and clinched the playoffs. Not quite the same thing. It's just, I think the Stars handled the end of the season better. And again, I know UC Saros goes down late in the season. That's something that the Predators can't control, but there's still a lot of talent on that team, and maybe the loss of such a key player like Saros was demoralizing. I can't necessarily speak into that situation just because I don't follow the Predators as closely, but I think if you look at the rosters and you look at the teams and just the leadership and the veterans on this Stars team especially, you see that there is that, the guys that are out there, 80 of the 82 games, or out there for all 82 games year in and year out, and just built for the mental and physical grind that is an NHL season. And then you even look at offseason additions, and I think that the Stars and Predators additions balance each other out fairly evenly. I know the Predators, that one of their big signings was, Niederreiter from the Carolina Hurricanes, but the Stars went out and got Mason Marchment. Both of them have similar numbers as far as points. Niederreiter a little bit more of a goal scorer. Marchment, at least based on his stats in Florida, a little bit more of a playmaker, going to rack up a little bit more assists than goals possibly. But, while both guys aren't exactly an identical player, I think that as far as skills and additions to the respective teams, that they balance each other out pretty well. They also add a little bit of depth to the defensive core, the Stars with Colin Miller, and the Predators with Ryan McDonough from the Tampa Bay Lightning. And so I don't think that either team necessarily gets an upper hand on offseason additions. I know that the Predators have the Stars number in the regular season last year, but that's just how it is in the rivalry. You see every year in and year out, it kind of goes back and forth between these teams on who has the upper hand, but Dallas ultimately did better in the playoffs. They were set up for more success with their number one goaltender being healthy, but even then, they had really strong showings from their defensive core and had some pretty good performances from some vets on the team like Joe Pavelski. And, you just even look at this season, UC Saros looking to be back and looking to, again, be one of the better goalies in the league. But as we've talked about this offseason, goalie situations tend to fluctuate. And I don't say this to be pessimistic. I certainly don't hope we start seeing a downfall of UC Saros. I would never wish someone's career to be damaged or ruined due to injury, but we just don't know how he's going to bounce back or what he's going to look like. Just tragically, the way his season ended, I believe it was an ankle injury whenever they were playing the Calgary Flames in the final stages of the season. You just never know with goalie situations. You can say, Ben Bishop was coming back from an injury, and obviously a little bit older and a little bit longer tenured than a guy like Saros. Saros still a relatively younger goalie, so it's likely that he's going to come back and be just fine and be just as productive as he has been in the past, but we just don't know what he's going to look like, and it's always kind of a toss-up with NHL goalies year in and year out, especially when they come off injuries and miss a huge chunk of time. So, Saar is going to be the same player that he was whenever he was last playing. And if he's not, or if he's going to miss time, how will the Predators manage? There's a lot that goes into it. I still personally think the Dallas Stars better off. It's still, two teams that I think are fairly evenly matched. And like I said, you make a case for either of them. I think you could easily make a case for either of these teams to sneak into the top 3 in the Central Division, but I can also see the case of them both potentially being wildcard teams yet again. I think these are two teams that will be fighting for playoff positioning late into the season, and we get Stars and Predators the first 2 games of the season at Nashville and 1 in Dallas. So I am excited for those games, as if there already isn't enough excitement in the opening of the season to have a back-to-back rivalry matchup, home-and-home split series. Going to be absolutely thrilling to watch, especially after all this. And I'm sure before the season, we'll talk with our friends over at Locked On Predators and get the rivalry going a little bit there as well. Well, coming up next, we're going to take a look at a different team on this list, a team that I have some major beef with the positioning that they're at. We'll talk about the Minnesota Wild after a quick break. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today around the sports world. BetOnline.net is where the game starts. All right, we're moving on this Friday episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you again for making us your first listen of the day. Continuing to break down the Central Division Power Rankings post-draft and free agency voted on by the Locked On NHL host. We talked about the Predators and the Stars. The rivalry there still going to be as exciting as ever this season. Teams that are going to be fighting for playoff positioning all throughout the season. But there's another team on here that I think will be fighting for playoff positioning, but I think might be a little too high on this list. And that team is, of course, the Minnesota Wild. It isn't just Locked On NHL rankings or Locked On Podcast Network rankings. There are several other sources, list, rankings, whatever you want to call it out there as well, that predict the Minnesota Wild to be a top 3 team, and a lot of them having them at that number 2 spot right behind the Colorado Avalanche. The Avs seem to be an undisputed number 1, which is understandable, and then it seems to go, some mixture of Wild, Blues, Stars, Predators, kind of rounding out that top 5. But I just do not see it. And this isn't the first time I've talked about this. I don't understand the hype or why this is a thing. Why people think that they're going to be the second best team in the division. I still certainly think they're going to be a good team. I think they're going to be a competitive team, but I don't think they will be second in the division, and I just cannot wrap my head around it. I guess maybe just recency bias of them having a fantastic year last year, especially in the regular season. They were a phenomenal regular season team, went on multiple win streaks of +5 games. Kirill Kaprizov is the real deal. He's a legit superstar in this league. He's fantastic. But I don't see what the Minnesota Wild have done this offseason to prove that they will actually be a top 3 team this season, or at least top 2. Maybe they can slide into that 3rd spot, but I just don't see it, and I don't understand. So if you're listening and you somehow have a little bit more insight on the Minnesota Wild situation, let me know down below, because it genuinely baffles me that this many people have this much confidence in them to be the second best team in the division. And I'm not saying that the Stars should be in that second spot or the Predators. I think that the St. Louis Blues will be a good team this year, or maybe it's just kind of a by default. Maybe the rest of the Central Division is pretty just mediocre, which is a very fair argument. This might be the weakest or the second weakest division in the NHL this year. The Eastern Conference divisions are absolutely loaded, and there's a few teams out in the Pacific that are good as well. So maybe this is just by default, the Minnesota Wild have to be second, but I think the Blues could make a legitimate case for that second spot as well, and I just don't fully buy the hype of this Minnesota Wild team, and the biggest reason for that is they haven't seemed to have found a replacement for Kevin Fiala and his 85 points. He is now in Los Angeles King. You talk about Pacific Division teams that are loading up for big years. I've talked about it before. I think the Kings are one of those squads, but they, now have Kevin Fiala. The Minnesota Wild don't have him. He was their second highest scorer last season, right behind Kaprizov, again, who is fantastic, who is great, who, if the Minnesota Wild have any success this season, he will likely be the driving force behind that. But they have some other good pieces as well. Hartman, Eriksson Ek, even they have some nice pieces on the defensive core still. This is still a talented Minnesota team. So don't hear me saying that this team is garbage or trash. I think that they will still, like the Preds and Stars, be fighting for playoff positioning this season. But you even look past the postseason, and I know or past the regular season, and look at the postseason this past year. I know we are so far away from the 2023 NHL playoffs, but they were a great regular season team. But then the steam just ran out on the train in the postseason against the Blues team that, even though the Blues were a good squad and they were probably the team that gave the Colorado Avalanche the most trouble out west, the Minnesota Wild, with home ice advantage and with the talent on their team, just seemed to get outmatched and manhandled in round one of that matchup with the St. Louis Blues. And I just have not seen what they've done to add to the roster or make it much better than they have last season. And I know part of that is because they still are paying some big money to guys on the roster, and I believe they're still even paying a few guys that aren't on the team, like Ryan Suter as well. But I just don't see how this team is going to be taking a step up from where they were last season. I think there's potential in the regular season that we could see them, maybe muster up a few of those win streaks again and maybe get off to a hot start, or, have a really nice stretch of games where they look like one of the better teams in the league. But I personally just don't see it. And I think you can even, talk about the goaltending situation as well, which we have on this show. It's such a weird situation that could work out really great or could, really run down in flames, to be quite honest. Marc-Andre Fleury is, as of right now, understandably going to be the number one guy. Again, Marc-Andre Fleury, one of the best goalies that we've ever seen in this league, but he's in his late 30s now. And Father Time is undefeated, not just in the NHL, but in every single sport, of eventually catching up to any professional athlete and humbling them and bringing them back down to human level. And we really haven't seen, a huge drop in production from Marc-Andre Fleury. He's still a pretty decent goaltender, all things considered, especially given his age and how many NHL games he has under his belt. But will he hold up? Will he be able to help propel this team throughout the majority of the season? And if he is able to stay healthy, will the production still be the same? If he has to miss time, is Philip Gustafson a good backup? He still seems really unproven. I know that there was a lot of criticism on Cam Talbot in Minnesota. There were people that liked him, people that didn't like him, people split down the middle. I get that. But Philip Gustafson is just unproven, and what we have seen from him, the small sample size, isn't fantastic. So if Marc-Andre Fleury either has to miss time or just isn't quite the goalie that he used to be, and the wear and tear finally starts to catch up with him, can Gustafson come in and provide solid goaltending for the Wild? It's obviously speculation right now and a question that we're going to have to wait to have answered, but that is a big question in my mind for this team. And then you even look at their numbers last season, their defense overall, they were 16th in goals against this past season, literally middle of the pack with 32 teams in this league. So the question with them, besides the goaltending, is can the offense still produce at a high level to support the literally middle of the pack defense, a defense that isn't fantastic, not going to blow you away, but also not terrible, not detrimental to the success of their team. And like I said, Kaprizov certainly can do that. Matt Zuccarello, Joel Eriksson Ek, Ryan Hartman, it's going to be on those guys. Can those guys step up, or at least can some players step up and even somewhat replicate the production that Kevin Fiala gave them last season? I'm curious to see how the Minnesota Wild do this season, but I just don't think I can buy the hype of them as the number 2 team. Again, I think they'll make the playoffs in some way or another. I think that they could be top 3, maybe sneaking into that 3rd spot. But at the end of the day, I don't think they're the second best team in this division. Well, coming up next, we will take a break from attacking the other Central Division teams and talk about why I think the Dallas Stars have a legitimate chance to rise up above their 5th place ranking on this list and could potentially sneak into the top 3 in the Central Division. Today's episode is brought to you by NHTSA. You're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many, and as the evening comes to an end, people start to head out. You think for calling for a ride, but no. You live nearby. You can make it home okay. It's no big deal. What are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, or you kill someone? Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our road to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. All right, we're closing out this week on Locked On Stars, continuing to talk about the Central Division Power Rankings according to a multitude of the Locked On NHL Podcast Network hosts. And now that we've really torn up and attacked two other teams in this division, let me now shift the focus to the titular Dallas Stars that we cover here on this show and talk about why they can actually be considered a threat to be really solid and really competitive in this division. Again, a division that, maybe even last year could be considered one of the better divisions in the league, but maybe is going to take a little bit of a dip this year, and not necessarily by fault of the bad teams in the division, but purely just because some of the teams in the other divisions in this league are just absolutely insane. Would not want to be playing in the Atlantic or the Metro right now. Those are just going to be absolute gauntlets. Even the lower tier teams in those divisions could give any other squad in the NHL trouble on any given night. But with the Dallas Stars, I think it's a mixture of two different things that could make them a threat to the Central Division and could give them a successful season. The first of those being the Stars getting a fresh start. And I say this really just with the arrival of Peter DeBoer and his new coaching staff. And you just look back at the past few years for this Stars franchise, and really just for the NHL, things have been incredibly chaotic with COVID, condensed schedules a few seasons ago, even a COVID pause last season in the middle of things around Christmas time. A lot of teams, every team was dealing with that. They're, dealing with taxi squads and roster shortages. But then with the Stars, and I know there were maybe a few other teams in the NHL dealing with this as well, you sprinkle in a coaching change. I mean, you have your head coach in Jim Montgomery get fired in December of 2019. You bring in this new coach, already pretty chaotic. But then Rick Bowness, new interim head coach, has to coach through a pandemic, the bubble in Edmonton, and all those other things I just talked about, condensed schedules, missing guys after, you make an appearance in the Stanley Cup Finals, and then just a few short months later, you're expected to field a team that is able to play back so many different back-to-backs, night in and night out, traveling a ton, just incredibly difficult to navigate for an interim head coach, and then eventually head coach of the Dallas Stars was Rick Bowness. And while the Rick Bowness era had its moments, it started out and was carried out through with so much chaos, which, the Stars did a pretty decent job, all things considered, of battling that adversity. But I have to imagine that it's nice for the front office, for management, for the team as a whole, for the franchise as a whole, to kind of have this breath of fresh air, this new kind of clean slate, fresh start with Pete DeBoer coming in as head coach, which he's been welcomed with mixed reviews by fans and even myself. But nonetheless, it's a fresh start, which I think is going to be huge and very nice for this team. A new coach who has had, this full offseason to acclimate to, being in this position to get settled in here into the city of Dallas and hopefully start getting to know a few of the guys on the team. And he'll have a full regular training camp to establish his roster, a full regular normal preseason to, give guys minutes and see in what way he can best formulate this team and, make this roster of 4 lines and 3 defensive pairings and 2 goaltenders and give us the best Dallas Stars team that we can possibly be seeing by opening night in Nashville. And of course, he also has a really solid group of returning veterans that can, help work with him to help lead this team. You have Jamie Benn, Tyler Seguin, Joe Pavelski, and even the younger guys on the team you could still consider veterans because they've been around for a few years now or a couple years for some, like Jason Robertson, Rope Hintz, Miro Heiskanen, and even other key players like Esa Lindell, who's, one of the longer tenured Dallas Stars now. It's a really great veteran leadership group to have at your back as the head coach, and hopefully there, like I said, already is some chemistry established between coaching staff and players, and we'll see this team click really well this preseason and help dress a really solid team at the start of this season without a ton of chaos going on behind the scenes, and what should hopefully be a normal preseason and regular season as well, all things considered. That's the first thing. The second thing, besides the fresh start, is, this could potentially be the last go around for this particular Dallas Stars team. Every few years, teams go through massive changes. You lose a lot of players. You maybe add some new players, and it just looks a lot different than it has for the past several seasons. And you look at the Stars roster, you look at their cap-friendly lineup, and there are several different guys who are on the last years of their deals or who are only on one-year deals, like Rope Hintz, Joe Pavelski, Denis Gurianov, Luke Glendening, Joel Kiviranta, Jacob Peterson, Joel Hanley, just to name a few. I think there's maybe a few other ones I missed, but there's a very real possibility that this Dallas Stars team is going to look very, very different at this time next year. I do think that some of the guys I just listed will likely be back. I think Rope Hintz will be back. I think there's a good chance Jacob Peterson could come back. But everyone else, it's we don't necessarily know. If Denis Gurianov has a big year, maybe he comes back, or maybe he does really well and has a great season and then goes and signs a new deal somewhere else where he can make a ton of money and potentially be on a competitive team that is at the same level or more competitive than the Stars. But I think that these guys are going to come together and play hard and play for one another, and they won't be an easy matchup for anyone on any given night, just because this team, this core of players has been through so much. Most of those guys that I just listed off were at the Stanley Cup run back in 2020. I think Luke Glendening and Jacob Peterson may be the only guys who weren't on that team. But so many of these players have been through all of those things that I just talked about: the coaching changes, the pandemic, the condensed schedules, the chaos that this league has endured over the past handful of seasons. These guys have been through a lot, and I think that means a ton for this core to play for one another and to play extremely hard, especially with the motivation of a new coach and a new coaching staff who is also seeking to vindicate himself a little bit and try to get his name maybe a little bit out of the mud, because I know sometimes Peter DeBoer's name can get dragged around a little bit in NHL circles. And his team, Peter DeBoer's teams, are historically good in the regular season and also string together some pretty good postseason runs as well. We've talked about at length how his teams have either made it to the Stanley Cup Finals or their conference finals, respectively, during his first season. It's not a guarantee that it's going to happen with the Stars, but I think that we will see a little bit of a new look Stars team and maybe start seeing them take the steps in the right direction to actually be a competitive team offensively, while also still maintaining that defensive composure that they've had that will look a little bit different in the absence of John Klingberg. But I think as we get closer to the season, the more and more excited I get to see how different this team looks and how successful they can be, because the pieces are there. The Stars have all the pieces that they need to be successful. They've got good goaltending, they've got good forwards, they've got good defensemen, and they've even got a bunch of young prospects and young guys that are going to be fighting and scrapping for roster spots at training camp. They just need to formulate which roster is the best to put out, and that's what training camp is for. That's what the preseason's for, and we just have to trust that the coaching staff is going to do the right things with these pieces to put this team in the best situation for success. And so I'm really excited to see what the Stars team is made of. With the Central Division maybe having a quote-unquote down year, this could be a great year for them to surprise some people and jump into a top 3 spot in this division. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you again for tuning in and for making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe here on YouTube, follow, and leave a rating and review on your favorite podcasting platform. We are free and available no matter where or how you choose to listen. Follow me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis, as well as our show at Locked On Stars. Hope you guys have a fantastic weekend. Stay safe, have fun, watch some college football. This is going to be a very fun time of year where sports are finally starting to come back into our lives and be a little bit more normal, with football here, basketball not too far away, hockey not too far away. Very, very exciting time to be a sports fan. Have a great weekend, Stars fans. We'll see you back here on Monday.